Thank you very much for joining us on the Voice of Job Seekers podcast. This is Mark, your host, and you're going to enjoy something special. We're doing this live in front of an audience, two-person audience right now. There's more people coming in a little bit later, but hopefully you'll be able to enjoy this particular broadcast. And for those who are watching on Facebook Live, welcome. And give us some love, hit us some hearts, and hopefully if you have to leave in part of this, this should be up on YouTube sometime, at least by Tuesday, maybe tonight, depends. Depends, I guess, after we have dinner there. But let's go right into the show. Want to introduce my friend, my very long-time friend, Tony Chatman. Tony is a corporate relationship expert and president of Chatman Enterprises Incorporated. Some of his clients include Social Security Administration, Chase, and U.S. Secret Service. Tony has been speaking on this nationally and is in demand. I mean, seriously. Dude just came from Alaska. And how many black people did you see in Alaska when you went?
More than I saw in Cape Cod, where I went to afterwards. How's that for you? I was actually surprised. There's a few. I think they all just huddled together.
Yeah, I think so as well. But I just want to welcome Tony to the show. How are you?
Doing great, Mark. Thanks for having me. Thanks for even doing this. I know this is our first time trying to do it live, and I think this is going to lead to a lot of great things in the future.
Yeah, I think so too, but I think a lot of people want to know because they've read articles, they've heard things about it, and some people are embracing it and some people are scared. And hopefully we can take some of the fear out and guide people to a more of a amicable and safe conversation.
Sure.
Because a lot of people hear that and they hear words like microaggressions and micro insults, and they go, "Uh-oh, they're going to talk about the R word," and it goes way beyond that. So let's kind of dispel some of that right now.
Sure.
Let's talk about what unconscious bias is, and since that's in the title, let's talk about that first.
All right, well, let's start off with just what bias is. Bias is nothing but a preference. It's, unfortunately the word prejudice has gotten a negative connotation from a lot of the diversity training and things of that nature. But we all have preferences. There are things we like and we don't like. Some of us have a bias towards apple juice versus orange juice, or we have a bias of certain types of cars. So we have these preferences. The problem is that when it comes to people, these preferences start to work almost like blind spots. So, if you want to look at unconscious bias really divided into two parts. And Daniel Kahneman, he actually won a Nobel Prize for his research. He said, if you look at how the brain works, there's two different thinking systems within it. Okay? System one is far more slow and deliberate. Okay, it's effortful. It's analytical and logical, but it takes conscious effort to make it happen. Okay, that is what we normally think of as our conscious brain. Okay? It's very effective, but it's got a limit in its effectiveness because at any given point, the average person can have as many as 11,000 pieces of information going on. You start looking at billboards and all this other stuff going on. The conscious brain can really only handle 40 things at a time. Okay? So there's this other thing that's working in the background, is system two, and it's far more effortless, and it originates out of impressions and feelings. It's intuitive and it's very fast, but what it does is it does things by association. So it takes these experiences and it just puts them into different buckets and silos, and it draws back on them as needed. But you don't think about it. It's just always going on in the background. And that's how we handle all that other information. That's really what the unconscious brain is. And unfortunately, that unconscious brain is also tied into the emotional centers of our brain. So what happens is, the reason I say all that, here's how we should think about unconscious bias. Unconscious bias is far less of a thought and far more of a feeling. and it's normally a very emotional feeling. So take this for example. I moved to New York 4.5 years ago.
Right.
I knew there would be a lot of wildlife, right? I knew there, because I don't live in New York City. So, yeah, possums, sure, makes sense. Deer, absolutely. Black bears, okay, kind of thought. You know what no one told me about?
What's that?
Rattlesnakes. Who thinks rattlesnakes in New York, right?
Right.
So I'm in my backyard, I'm raking, I hear about this. There's actually a rattlesnake preserve 3 miles from my house. I have no idea why we want to preserve the number of rattlesnakes in New York, but that's another story.
Right.
And I'm over here and I'm raking the leaves, and something slithers across my foot. Immediately, I react, I jump, I move. I'm not thinking, but the next thing you know, I'm on my deck, right?
Right.
That's unconscious bias. Before I had a chance to think, I'm already reacting. I'm already forming opinions, and they're very emotional opinions. Unfortunately, that's what happens with people, too. So the way unconscious bias begins to work is, you see someone and you see someone that you're familiar with, right? And so there's a preference. There's a thing called affinity bias where people who are like us, we want to associate with them more. We actually give them more empathy because the neural pathways we use to think about ourselves, we use to think about the people who are like us. But then let's say you had a bad experience with a tall person back in the, sometime. Then you see another tall person, your brain's going to draw on that past history before you ever make a decision, and you're just going to feel really weird about it. You have this bad gut feeling. It's the gut feeling that's the biggest danger.
Now, has this, there's no time reaction when the brain first experiences it and then starts to respond. The time lapse between the engagement and the reaction.
Well, I don't know the numbers, but the time lapse, what happens is the unconscious part goes way before our thinking part goes. So we're already reacting, and now we're trying to decipher whether that was right or wrong.
Right.
We're dealing with the emotions. So immediately something happens, and it happens before you can think about it. And so that's how it works.
Yeah, I was just thinking about vegetables and how it takes so quickly for me to avoid the vegetable plate as opposed to the dessert plate. Dessert, I automatically go to.
Absolutely.
But,
right.
Yeah, so I think we discriminate so often. Is there any idea how the brain keeps up with all the barriers and filters that we go through?
Well, that's where the stereotypes come in. And what it does is the brain makes it as simple as possible. So accuracy is not important. Simplicity is important.
Gotcha.
And so the more information it is, the simpler it wants it to be. So that's why you could say, I've met 3 Asian people in my life, and so all Asians fall into this category that makes it easier for me to deal with in the future.
Right. So really, again, just to reemphasize, it is not often about the person that has the bias. It's about how the brain reacts to somewhat how they're orientated.
Well, yeah, so that's... Okay, so let's go there. That's part of why I started doing this training versus diversity training. Previous diversity training was all about if you're not inclusive, you're a bad person and you have bad intentions.
Right.
And although there's a part of that may be true, for far more people, it's the unconscious part that's going. And what they don't realize is, we've been talking somewhat technically about this, but how you were raised, what you've experienced, your geographic location, and what you watch on TV, listen to on radio, all we're doing is we're programming our unconscious mind constantly.
Yeah.
Okay? And so what we're doing is basically we're programming our auto responses, which is the very dangerous part about it because, in this age of information we're in right now, you'd think people would be more knowledgeable about things, but they're just as ignorant as they were 25 years ago. The difference is before they were uninformed, now they're misinformed. So that's a deep thing, right?
Right.
So now we have all these strong opinions because we chose the TV show, the news channel we're going to watch. And so we're constantly getting that feed of information. And then we go to Facebook And Facebook's algorithms, they take all of our current likes and they just feed into our biases. We don't get both sides of the story.
Right.
And so now we've seen this over and over and over again, and we immediately say, okay, here's my intent, here's my, here's where I am, and we're literally programming our mind to respond in a certain way. And so then it's not just about race. And I want to make this comment, okay? I'm going to group people into horrible categories, okay?
Right.
Because, for example, I use the word black instead of African American.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I do it is when you see me walking down the street, you don't know if I'm African American or Cuban or Haitian, but you know I'm black.
Right.
I use Hispanic. There's a huge difference between being Mexican, Colombian, Dominican, Puerto Rican, and if you put them all in the same room together, they may not make it out. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
But in the United States, we just look at all of them and say Hispanic, and that's how I group them together, and that's where our biases start to filter in.
Mm-hmm.
We do Asian. There's a huge difference between just Japanese and Chinese.
Right.
But so we have these extremely simplified groups that we use, then we just continually program our minds to respond to it.
Right. Now, just to let the audience know, my eyes are roaming because I'm watching Facebook Live, I'm recording the podcast, and I'm looking at the faces of everybody here. So it's not because I'm not paying attention to him. I am paying attention. I've just got to toggle all these different pieces of technology in people. So
right.
My apologies if that seems to disarm some of you or seems to arm some of you. So getting back to some of the scientific part of it, ultimately, it's hard to appreciate how fast our minds and maybe even our hearts respond to things that we don't want to see.
Mm-hmm.
So if there is a chance to slow down the speed of the game, so to speak, are there some practical things that people should take note of or should do in order for them to say, hey, wait a second, let me think a second time about this?
Sure. The first thing you should do is, number one, be aware that the majority of us have biases.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. When we pretend that we don't, that's when there's the greatest danger.
Mm-hmm.
Let me give you a stat. There's a test out there that's run by Harvard. It was actually started by Yale, and it's called the implicit associations test.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And what it does is it actually measures how quickly we respond to different associations. And
I believe that's at ita.org. If
IAT.
IAT, right.
Yeah.
IAT.org for those of you who want to go and take it, in which I've recommended people taking those who I've talked to.
Right. So here's what's fascinating, though, about that, right? So, for example, 76% of people, or let's do this one, 75% of people have an implicit preference or an unconscious preference for white people over black people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's 75%. Now, A, that shouldn't surprise people.
No.
But B, let me tell you what I didn't say. I didn't say 75% of white people have a preference for white people over black people.
Mm.
So let that sink in for a second, right?
Right.
So I said 75% of people. So it's very possible that you and I, being black, could still have a preference for white people over black people because of the way we've allowed our minds to be programmed.
Yeah.
The same way I would say 76% of people more readily associate men with careers and women with staying home with the family.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't say 76% of women, or 76% of people prefer able-bodied people versus someone with a disability. But I didn't say 76% of able-bodied people have that preference.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is the bias knows no bounds. It's what we've allowed to program into our mind that really affects how we do this. So, I'm sorry, now, I didn't even answer the original question. So now going back, knowing then that I could be biased, knowing that you could be biased, knowing that the people sitting here in the audience or that are watching this could be biased, now we know, hey, I know I have a blind spot. So just like you would do in a car, before I make a reaction, let me go and check that mirror. So why am I responding this way? Why am I more agitated with this person when they do this, when that person over there does the exact same thing and it doesn't bother me? Being aware helps us in a great way.
Well, it seems as though bias also kind of can dictate and change around the words that we hear and how we filter it. It can actually change, maybe not yes from no, but as you demonstrated in the example that you gave, is that you could have said that white people are prefer white people without having said it, but I could have heard it that way.
Right. Yes. Well, so it's okay. Optics play a big role in this. Okay, so we're going to do a little experiment with the people we have. Right now we have 3 people live, and you could do this at home with us, okay? So check this out. All right, let's see if I can get this pointed at the group. So, is this pointing at you guys now? Can you guys see you? There? Okay. All right, 2. We'll start with 2, okay? So, I want you to do exactly what I say, okay? Okay. All right, so you do exactly what I say, okay? Take your right hand, put it in the air. I'll wait for everybody to go. Okay, take your finger, point to the sky. Take your finger and your thumb, make a circle. Take that circle, put on your chin. Chin. See what happened? You there. Yeah. So what happened, they went, one person went, ooh. Other people were just standing there like, you said chin, right? So what happens is, even though you heard one thing, you saw something else. And what you saw took precedence over what you heard. And so, so what happens is bias is the same thing. You can say something in a very clear way, but once my bias kicks in, it trumps what I just heard, and I reinterpret what I just heard.
Now, that was fascinating. I've seen exercises like that, especially with the word association. And there's Google has put out a couple of interesting videos on unconscious bias and how there's word association. So, you raise your hand if or you say right or left, depending upon what the word in the group is. So I can see that happening. But there's also the fact that not that anything needs to be said or anything experienced, that there's also in us being influenced by people that may influence us, but they don't have to say anything to influence us. They can just do, and then they could follow because they see that as the right thing to do.
Sure.
Harvard did a study not too long ago where they had a leader, then they had other leaders below them and leaders below them, and then and I wish I can remember exactly where, but what they decided, they had one group, they had 2 sets of groups, and they each had level leaders, and one leader just did things and didn't tell how to do it. He did some instruction, but it wasn't intense instruction. Then the other leader provided intense instruction. And they found that between the one that intensely did it and the one that didn't do so much, there wasn't that much of a difference. So there was one, if they saw the leader treat a person in a certain way, then they know that they knew the next level leaders saw that they need to treat that person or a person like them the same way.
Sure, yeah.
And then the other one gave clear instructions, but there was really not a difference between the two. And I just found that very interesting how that a lot of things that we see are caught and not particularly taught.
Yeah.
If this is a better way to say it.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, absolutely. And they're caught and not taught, but we're not aware that we're catching them.
Right.
And that's the key to it.
Right.
Because then if you went back and asked those people, how do you treat the employees that are under you? Oh, I'm very fair. I would, they would go back and not be aware at all of how they're really treating people.
Sure. So that explains organizations that a buying, how should I say, a buying public that's purchasing products. They may not necessarily have to be told to buy this product if everybody is buying the product, or a lot of people are buying the product that they like, and are saying, this is really great. And they say, well, hey, automatically I'm thinking, this is the product for me to buy without even testing what else is out there. They've already got a firsthand rave about it, so they respond to that automatically.
Yeah, but that's exactly how advertising works. And unfortunately, if you look at how much of our TV works, a lot of the things that are being given, even reporting, is far more advertising now than it is informational. It's the exact same thing. You see someone who seems to be credible in one area talk about an area that they have no familiarity with.
Right.
Well, they must be smart in that area as well, or they must represent this community as well because they look like that person. And you're thinking, they don't represent me, or all these things. We're making these associations, and we never know what's happening.
Yeah, and I think it affects every organization that has a leader, and they depend on that leader to kind of guide them through, whether it's life, their workplace, and career. And I think we even see it a lot as far as I see it a lot in my world when it comes to job interviews and things like that. The bias plays a large part of it. And in fact, I would even go to say that many employers rely on other people's biases for them to guide them through the process of an interview. I think even, and there are things that, as I think about it, you don't even have to say outright for a bias to even taking place. For instance, and to give you some free job interview advice, a great question to ask in an interview is, at the end, after you've gotten all the information and you've asked some questions, hopefully, of the employer, not just them interrogating you, is to ask them, hey, is there anything that I'm missing that wouldn't make me the best candidate? What is it that I need to know, or what is it that that I'm missing for you to hire me right now? And I had a client recently who asked that very question. And the interviewer thought about it and said, I believe that, and I'm just wondering if you can really keep up with the environment that we're in. Now, tell you a little bit about the client. The client, slight gray hair, mid-50s, and talks a little slow, but has a lot of skill. So the response to that question, as he was telling me about it, says, oh, he thinks you're too old for the position.
Sure. Well, okay, so let's go there, right?
Right. Yeah, I'm
going
to go. I'm a go there guy. You should know that.
Let's go there.
You should know that.
There. So here's a great example, right? One industry that is very white male dominated is U.S. orchestras and symphonies, right? And you would think, well, there's not a lot of bias in that because it's just musical performance, right? You sit there, someone plays a flute, either they're good or they're bad. But what they realized is there may be some bias against women in U.S. orchestras. So they tried something. What they did is they put a curtain between the performer who was auditioning and the judges. And the minute that they did it, women's chances of making it past the first round increased 50%. Because even though people did not think they were being biased, they thought they were objective, what they saw was dominating what they hear. And so now you take that and you extrapolate it to someone who has a disability or Asperger's syndrome. You deal with someone, let's just take height and the fact that 50% of CEOs are 6 foot tall or taller, and yet that's only 14.9% of the population, and that 30% are 6'2" or taller, and that's only 3.9% of the male population.
Wow.
So now you say, okay, height, there's a bias of height that it means the ability to lead and to be in charge and domination, and then you take that and you say, okay, but how does that work for women? It's interesting how the brain works. When standing in a corridor, people overestimate the height of men and underestimate the height of women. So that gives them an immediate disadvantage if there really is a height bias. So all of this now starts to play in. And, we haven't even gotten into someone's name.
Oh, we can go way
and the fact
down
that
the line for that.
Resumes with a white-sounding name are 50% more likely to get a callback for an interview than black-sounding names, and that a white name is equivalent to 8 years of job experience on a resume.
Well, it's always been interesting. In fact, I did a show on it about 2 years ago, where we talked about name discrimination. That between Jamal and James is going to get the more looks than Jamal because one, people are afraid to pronounce it, but two, there are some other things that come into it and other assumptions that kind of come into it as well. But even, and I think the studies that have been done recently, I think it was in the UK, where they took resumes and they put the same resume but different names and different ethnic names. And, of course, the more white-sounding names got more responses, even though the exact resume was being used and it was just changed. And we can probably even go down the line, too, about addresses. Address is another one. Something that when I was a manager at a company, I won't name anymore, but the director used to ask, well, how do you come to us? And that was a more or less, and I don't know if it was methodical. If you took the bus or a train, it's a little bit different than if you took a taxi or if you walked.
Well, it's like asking how many kids do you have, or are you planning to start a family to a lady so you figure out whether she's going to get pregnant or not, right?
Sure.
Or how about this one? The American Journal of Sociology determined that for African Americans and for Latino men, those with lighter skin were viewed as more intelligent by their interviewers.
Sure.
So all of those things now start to play in, right? And you said the name between Jamal and John, but it's also the same thing between Heidi and Howard.
Yeah.
Because, you have the famous study with Heidi Roizen, who is a very well-known venture capitalist who's, I think last year was considered one of the most connected women in Silicon Valley. When Harvard Business Review, when they took her bio, and they changed the name to Howard and they sent it out, Howard seemed like a better person to work for. Heidi was, a little bit more of a B. Right. And so but then you say, okay, we're going with the basic bias, right?
Right.
So how about this one? How about how it is with people who are obese? There's bias against obesity, right?
Yes.
I've sat in the meetings and dealt with HR people say, well, people who are overweight tend to be more dishonest and deceitful. I'm like, well, where'd you get that from? But attractive women make, on average, $19,000 a year more than their heavier counterparts. And what's even crazier, this is going to blow your mind. Two things are going to blow your mind. Not only is it, if you're overweight, are you less likely to get hired?
Right.
Okay, number one, if you're in a waiting room waiting to be interviewed, and the interviewer comes out and sees you sitting next to someone who's obese, you're also less likely to get hired.
Right.
Okay, so you have that.
Right.
Then you have the fact that juries are more likely to convict an unattractive, overweight woman than they are a thinner, attractive woman. And it's not just, I think she's attractive. When surveyed, they actually said about the women who weren't as attractive that they were more likely to be repeat offenders or to be knowledgeable about their crimes. But we're talking about things that just have nothing to do with it, right? So when we were in Alaska, Susan Boyle came up, right, from The Voice. You guys are familiar with Susan Boyle?
Yes.
And we were talking about, if you're not familiar with Susan Boyle, she won, it was not The Voice, it was Britain's Got Talent, I think it was. And, Susan steps up and doesn't have the best physical appearances. She didn't have the best clothes on. She's not, the thinnest person. And yet when she sang, people were amazed by her voice, right? But then the question is, so all the things we just judged her on, what do they have to do with the person's ability to sing? Absolutely zero. But we, our optics affected what we thought her talent would be.
And, I think one of the things that we really don't consider is, as well, and even breaking it down to a further level when we talk about obesity and just our indifferences or our differences is what people say on a regular basis to us in a daily conversation. And, I hear a lot of this as well. And I was just thinking about how, we've heard throughout our lives that, he's kind of cute for a fat boy. And it's like, that's you just compliment. You try to compliment. It's sort of like
he speaks so well.
Yeah, he's so articulate.
Yeah,
it's like plus times a minus is really a minus.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
in that sense, and I think as I see it, that happens very often, especially throughout my lifetime and probably yours too, when you've called. And you set up an interview, and then you're not what they expected.
Yeah. So most of my clients have no idea I'm black when I'm on the phone.
Right.
I walk in, here's a story. I was doing a public service announcement about 7 or 8 years ago here in Chicago.
Right.
We were recording it, and there was a woman who was a model. She goes, "Oh, you're phenomenal. I think my agency would love you. We do voiceover work, everything." And they literally were next door to the studio we were working at. Mm-hmm. So she called during one of the breaks, set up an appointment for me to go over there. I go over. The woman says, "Okay, I'm going to hand you 2 scripts. I want you to prepare for them. Get ready." One was for barbecue sauce, and the other was for Cadillac Escalades. Right? And so it was And then, what do you think the feedback that I got was? And she did not hide it. What do you think she said?
You're not who I thought you were.
You don't sound black enough.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just, I don't want to be offensive, but you just don't sound black enough. I'm like, Well,
that's interesting. Well, you remember the movie. I can't think of it. It was a large movie, and it won an Academy Award. Tony Danza was in it, and he was in a scene with, he was portraying an actor. And in that scene, the young boy had changed the way the script had said. It wasn't ethnic. He did it grammatically correct. So Tony Danza went to the director and said, did this kid go to college or something? I can't think of the movie, but it was a really big movie. But the point being is that he didn't say it like he was black.
Right. But, that's the funny thing about it is, you could talk about it in terms of black or white.
Right.
But you also, the studies that have been done say, so they did this really cool thing. They had a bunch of people record these trivia facts that could or couldn't be true, right? Mm-hmm. For example, one could be, I think one of them was a giraffe can go as long without water as a camel, right? Mm-hmm. Who knows, right?
Right.
So then they had people read them, and then the person had to determine whether or not the statement was true.
Right.
Now, they were told before they were going to judge the statement, the person speaking did not come up with these. These were given to them by researchers. Mm-hmm. But people with accents outside of the United States were less likely to be believed.
Yeah.
Okay? It's the same thing as there's a bias against people who have a Southern accent, or people who have a New England accent,
or New York accent,
right? Or if you're outside of Chicago,
yeah,
the Bears, right? The Bears. So you have all of these, and they're just all kind of swimming around. And what's interesting, because I was looking at one of the comments that was made by Stephanie here on Facebook Live, talking about some of the students have their names issues. Other ethnicities are just as creative with their names, but they're not judged the same.
Right.
For them, it's, that's unique. That's really cool. That's whatever. Where, for people who are minorities, well, you guys need to assimilate.
Yeah.
It's a very different scale that they're given.
Yeah. I think and by the way, those of you doing Facebook Live, we'll take questions here in a few minutes. Just want to kind of set some basis for our discussion.
Hey, and as he says, this is my first time on Facebook Live, so I'm trying to see how to see all the older comments, by the way, because I see the most current one.
Right.
And, we'll figure that out.
Yeah, we'll figure that out. But those of you...
There we go. Got it.
Okay, so those of you who have questions, you can start asking questions. We may not get to them for another few minutes, so please be patient. And, of course, those of you who are here, we'll be sure to entertain your questions or comments or anything that you have to share here in the next few minutes. But, again, just trying to lay some groundwork. So,
and one of the questions that came up, yes, this is being recorded. So both the Facebook Live videos will be available as well as the podcast will be available on iTunes.
Right. And it will be also a YouTube video based on the Facebook Live stuff. So don't worry, you'll get plenty of chances to see it. And if you have to miss part of it, we thank you for tuning in as we're doing it.
Can I come back to one thing, though, about bias?
Sure, go ahead.
Here's how strangely it works, okay? It really permeates our society.
Okay.
Really, in ways that you would never consider. So, a study was done with Major League Baseball, and what they found is that this is from the years 2004 to 2006. Umpires were less likely to call a strike against pitchers who look like them.
Interesting.
Okay. Now, when they described what happened, it was far less of, he looks like me, so I'm not going to call a strike. It was what they determined is, a good pitcher knows how to paint the corners, right?
Right.
So if the pitcher looked like the umpire, the strike zone widened just slightly.
Interesting.
And that's really, I think, what happens in the workplace, too. So, when there's an interview, when it's close, the strike zone just widens slightly for the people that we have a bias towards versus the ones we have against.
Sure.
When we're doing performance evaluations, the strike zone just widens ever so slightly in someone else's favor, and then those biases start to matriculate throughout the system.
And that's what's so tough about, interviewing, and it's been going on for years, that most of it is gut instinct, right? It's
Yes.
really based on how somebody feels that you're going to do, where there are no real predictable measures or really built on merit. As much as we would like it to be, what it comes down to, if it comes down to two candidates, it's who do I feel that is going to,
Yes.
do the better jobs. When somebody says feel, that means I'm going to trust my gut.
Right. So let me just say this first. Never go with your gut, period. When you say I'm going, I shouldn't say never, but if you're thinking I need to go with your gut, you need to really assess the situation. Because normally, when someone says I'm going with my gut, basically I'm putting all logic aside, I'm going with my feelings.
Right.
Okay. So there's a thing called haptic sensation, okay? Because your gut can be manipulated. This is crazy. So they do this experiment. This has been repeated over and over again. The 4 people interview, right? All the exact same qualifications, same skill set, same answers to all the questions. But for 2 of the interviewers, you know what they do? Right before the interview, they give them something warm to drink.
Okay.
And every time the interviewer was given something warm to drink, they were more likely to hire the person. And every time they were given something cold to drink, they were less likely to hire the person. Because haptic sensation is based on touch. It could be rough feel, it could be temperature. But what it does is it affects emotionally how you interpret things. So that gut feeling is thrown off by haptic sensation.
Well, I think there's a little bit of science behind that because that's what, when you have gas, they recommend peppermint tea. Peppermint tea warms your stomach. It makes your stomach feels better. So I think there's a little bit of science behind how you feel you perform better, or how you're perceptively feeling.
Right.
You tend to perform, even if it's just a hair better, you do better.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why, especially when we talk about things where you go with your gut, that's why accountability becomes so important.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think people are afraid in the workplace of accountability, but you go back to the baseball example I just used, right? When they repeated the study back in 2012, the bias was almost completely eliminated. But the difference was that now, if you watch a Major League Baseball game, there's a pitch camera. You can see where every pitch goes.
Yeah.
And even though they don't change the calls because of that. The umpire, some have even said, There are pitches that I would have given to the pitcher that I knew I couldn't because it was on the screen. They've actually said that. So that accountability actually counteracts the effect of bias. So there has to be, that system within the workplace to say, hey, it's great that, this is exciting, that I have this feeling. And of course, I'm not biased because I'm just the most subjective person in the world. Well, that's great. If you're so subjective, then you should also be okay with this group of people going back and just making sure that that decision was as objective as you said.
And I think you're leading to something that we also want to discuss, is just trying to make the conscious unconscious, or make the unconscious conscious, to kind of start to have those workplace conversations, those career conversations, and everyday life as well, to help people get over those humps of how they feel when bias is applied to them.
Yeah.
We know it as microaggressions or assumptions, which people put on us, or we put on other people. And again, this transcends race or how you feel about different racial groups. There's so many people, like slow speakers. I think I used to be the president of the slow speakers of America.
Has there been an election that's gotten you out of it? I thought you were still there.
No, I think by default they forgot all about me.
Oh, okay. But sure. Well, if they listen to this podcast, you may be reelected.
Yeah. I'll take that. Okay, a little bit of shade to go along with my recording here, but I think to add some merit, people, how you speak and your grammar is perceived in a different kind of way, and some people react differently than others. And I think that transcends to the workplace in the fact that people will look at how you speak, the words you use, and the way that you use them, and to describe your performance, or better yet, to judge your performance.
Sure. Yeah. I would even go, before I was really focusing as much on diversity and unconscious bias, you even see the same thing from a personality standpoint.
Sure.
If you have an interviewer who is introverted, very detail-oriented, he or she is going to be more likely to hire someone who's introverted and more detail-oriented, even if that's not what the job calls for.
Right.
Because so there's a word called affinity bias, okay? Affinity bias is where the neural pathways that we use to think about ourselves are the same ones that we use to think about people who we view as being like us.
Right.
Okay? So if I view this person in the audience as being like me, I'm going to be far more empathetic with them. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt far more. Whereas if I don't feel like I am, similar to this person over here, it's not that I'm going to be mean or rude to them. I'm just going to be far more objective, okay? So they don't get the benefit of the doubt. They don't get empathy. Because I don't picture myself in the same situation with them as I do with the person I'm empathetic with. So that's why it really transcends all the normal dimensions of diversity that we think about. And it's what damages corporations, though, right? So you go back to what you said earlier, we far more times it's not what we're taught, it's what we've caught. But then what happens is if you get, a head of a company who has X personality and X bias, that just disseminates through the entire organization.
Sure.
They hire people who are like them, who hires more people who are like them, and then they have a bad experience with someone who's not like them.
Right.
And they go, well, I can't hire a person like that anymore, right? Because that would go against my confirmation bias, right? I've got to, what we do is once we make these biases, then we fight to keep them. And it's almost like if you, let's say you're going to go out and buy a new car. Let's say you decide to buy a Prius, right?
Right.
You ever notice then all of a sudden you notice all the other Priuses that are on the road? They were there the whole time. You just never noticed them until it was important. That's the same thing we do with all of our biases. So hire this, and here's my favorite example, because for some reason it has become socially acceptable to have biases against generations. So you hire this millennial, right? Oh, they come in and they show up when they want to, and they're on their phone all the time. They don't have any good work ethic, and and all of a sudden you're like, well, here's how millennials are. But then you hire 3 more millennials that are phenomenal. They're unbelievable, perfect. examples of what an employee should be. But then you hire that fifth person, and they're a millennial, just like the first one. You're like, see, that's how millennials are. Mm-hmm. And yet you've got examples that counteract that very bias right in front of your face, but you ignore it because it wasn't the Prius that you were looking for.
It's interesting you should mention that. There's I think more about this app that's going to be coming out hopefully in the next year is by Blendor. It's run by a black woman, a black gay woman, who's actually been on the show a little while ago. And she has an app where it takes out the photo and any personally identifying information like the name, and all those that identify, so that way companies will be more apt to at least give a first look to someone without the chance of having bias coming into play.
Yeah. That's an unbelievable thing. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
The question is, how willing will companies be to embrace it, and how much will they fight to enforce the decisions that are made by it?
Well, it's interesting is that Stephanie Lampkin is her name, and she had to fight two biases to be on one of 15 black women in the whole world who get capital funding, and the fact that she's black, she's gay, she's black, and really the third one, she's a woman.
Right.
To even accentuate the point even more. But I think one of the things that employers are starting to buy into it because they're beginning to see what type of businesses and what type of people that they're not embracing that they want to sell their product to. If you are selling technology, you definitely want people of color to buy into it, especially in certain areas. But if they don't look like you, then, or you don't look like them, then it's likely they'll apply their own biases and say, I'm going to go with more of the guy that looks like me. I'm going to buy from him. As opposed to the guy that doesn't. But I think that's overall, it depends on who would be able to identify with, whoever's selling.
Sure. Number one, I think it's an amazing product. I'm looking forward to it. I saw the links on it. The concerns, though, that I have on top of it are just because you get people into the job system or even get them into the organization, because there certainly is a business case for diversity, whether it's innovation, productivity, culture, all those things. The thing that concerns me is what happens when they get in the organization if they haven't really created an inclusive culture.
Well, I was going to say that's where inclusion comes in. The diversity part, okay, you're willing to spend the money, but for the employers that hoping to say that their job is done, the inclusion part takes a lot more to implement and to be sure that it goes throughout the organization instead of just getting some faces to fill the seat to say that you've done a job.
Yeah, because the part that would concern me, there's a thing called solo status. Okay? When a person is the first or one of the few in an organization, like I was at a kind of a think tank type thing, and a woman who was in my class was the first female brigadier general, right? So we had a conversation. I had another conversation with a woman who was the first female on, I can't remember what type of boat it was, in the part of the naval industry. But when you're the only one or the first, the amount of aggression, and we talk about microaggressions, but some of these microaggressions aren't that micro. Okay?
Right. Yeah,
the aggressions that you get, like, let me give you an example. I went to a large university, Western Michigan University. I think while I was there, the undergraduate population was 22,000. Okay, but I was in a very small, exclusive program called Paper Science. I'm only the second black to ever graduate from my college in that degree. So, my college experience was very different than most. But then when I went into the industry, the things that I experienced, sitting in my boss's office and a paper mill manager from Maine calling, him being on speakerphone, not knowing that I'm in the room, saying, hey, yeah, that monkey that you sent up to work last week, he got lost on his way to the mill. Things of that nature when you're the only person.
Sure.
And so there has to be, some kind of an infrastructure now set up for this inclusion to happen, because the danger is we get people into these positions, there is no inclusion, they fail, and now it's like, see, we tried, they're just not qualified. And so it's what she has is an amazing product and an amazing fix, but it's not the fix. It's got to be a component of the fix.
Well, there's the element as well in the fact that people are much smarter these days, and with the transparency that we have with social media, people are going to check out companies a little bit closer. And in looking at some of the, if you go to Glassdoor or some of the others where they have reviews of companies, Glassdoor is the biggest in the world, without question. You can go and check to see if the company has had incidences of racial tension or people not feeling comfortable, and then the people can read between the lines.
Sure.
But we have all these different tools that are out there. You can Google companies. You can, look at the board of the company, or look at the people that make up the company to see how diverse they are. If you don't see people that are like you, you should further investigate or further look at it, as opposed to just buying in and saying that they'll take care of you, which is not true really, any employer these days. But if you're looking to advance your career, look to see if they're advancing people who are executives or board chairmen or people who are on the board, and to go down from there. Instead of just accepting and saying that you hope to, or thinking that you're going to break the glass ceiling. Because likely, if they don't have people that are on that executive committee or executives that are like you, or faces that you would like to see, particularly if people of color, they're going to look to see if there are other people of color. If you're Hispanic, you look to see if there's any Latinos that are there.
Sure. Okay, can I say something, though? I mean,
Sure.
I totally agree with you. And, I think that has to be looked at. We don't want to jump into that situation. I think we also don't want to negate the situation.
Right.
It just calls for further research.
Okay.
So
right.
Basically, it's just for further research.
It's basically you can't companies can't underestimate or saying that diversity is good. We just hire all these people, and years later, everybody that's in upper level management looks like you.
Right, absolutely. So let me kind of go back into why this is so important for me. Okay. Initially, I was asked to do some diversity. I'd done diversity training in the past. I stopped. And 2 years ago, a client said, hey, I really want you to do some training for me. And I said no. And I mean, it was very, very well paying. Right. I just didn't want to do it for two reasons. Number one, I felt that most organizations were doing diversity just to check something off the box, and they weren't going to do anything about it. Okay? Don't want to waste my time, don't want to waste their time.
Right.
But number two, my struggle with diversity workshops were that it always had intent behind it and made people feel guilty at times. I didn't think they should feel guilty.
Right.
And that's part of the conversation I think that also needs to be part of this. The goal of this conversation and the goal of the unconscious bias training and everything else is not so that this one group feels bad and this group feels better. We've got to figure out ways to bridge gaps, and a lot of the gaps that we're trying to bridge aren't really there. They're made up. And so a lot of our differences are more from, like I said earlier, how we programmed our thinking. And so when we think these things, now we see things that are not there. So you see a police officer, interact with a minority person, pull out a gun, shoot them, and say, I was scared for my life. But sometimes they were, but it's, why were you afraid? What are the things that have been programmed into you that would make you respond in a way that other people, when looking at it, would not feel that threat?
Right.
So how do we now go into the workplace and make inclusion and diversity no longer a taboo conversation.
Right.
And not just, let me be honest, not just the workplace, our communities, our church, our family. I mean, all these different places where people are afraid to talk about the elephant in the room. We have to be able to look at a situation, and I have to be able to talk to someone who has maybe committed microaggressions against me without knowing it, and yet realize they don't know it. They have no intention behind it.
Right.
It's not a statement that they're a bad person. So how do we have this conversation so that we no longer do this and do this with other people?
Yeah.
Like that's what's often missed, because it's easy to take this and say, okay, now we're going to, whether it's someone who's disabled, or whether it's a gender thing, or whether it's accent, or whether it's people who are short, and all these things, when we talk about in-groups and out-groups, all these things can apply across the board, because you have situations where, if you look at the number of times in a meeting that women come up with a great idea and nobody knows it. And then 3 minutes later, Bob says the exact same thing, and it's like a Guinness commercial.
Genius.
Brilliant,
Right.
But the same thing happens when people who are short, right? And the tall person says it, and it's like, that was amazing. And here's what's scary. What's scary is most people only fight for their own in-group, and that's what kills me. Or their own out-group, I should say. So, people want to get really upset when it's about women, but then ignore when it's about someone who's disabled. Or really get upset when it's about race, but ignore someone when it's like this. And historically, that's what we've done. So it was easy for Susan B. Anthony, and I can't remember the other woman, to recruit Ida B. Wells to try to, for women's rights. But then they didn't want black people to vote. So they started the White Women's Suffrage Association. So it's, how do you do that? And over time, this extrapolates. And you may think, well, this doesn't really affect me. It's a bias. It doesn't, it's I fall into the right category. And then you start thinking about all the crazy things that have happened in history. Like I was reading about the killing fields, with the Khmer Rouge with Phnom Penh.
Right.
And the hundreds of thousands of people who were killed because they were viewed as a threat, because they were considered more intelligent. And what was the basis for making that decision? They wore glasses. So you have hundreds of thousands of people who were biased against because they wore glasses and were killed because the thought was if they wear glasses, they're far more intelligent, because people just have these perceptions, and it affects generations of people. And so we have to be able to say bias is an issue across the board. So it just can't be because I'm a black male, I'm concerned about it, or I'm only concerned about it with race. I've got to also look at this guy over here who's in the same workplace with Asperger's and look at how he's being treated. Or look at the woman who is deaf and she's very capable at her job, but no one wants to interact with her because it's uncomfortable. Or then go to the person who is non-binary sexually and say, okay, maybe that seems awkward, but I can't allow her to be treated that way, because just because that bias isn't against me doesn't make it right, or doesn't make it something I can ignore.
Well, there's a couple of things I thought about while you were sharing. One is diversity and inclusion training is usually just diversity and inclusion training. There's no feedback. As when they're being trained. They're just told, okay, we're addressing these issues, and that's it. Nobody says, well, I've experienced this or I've experienced that. So when I went in to do some training recently, I said I would want some engagement. I need to hear from you guys what you feel you hear, because the training isn't just about you making the transgressions. It's about the receiver as well. It's about how they feel and how they are experiencing what you say. And sometimes you could be the person, and again, this transcends race, and gender and that whole discussion. We can probably go on and on about it, but how that person feels. And a lot of people feel if they feel enough of it in the course of a day, years, they feel attacked.
Yep.
And there's plenty of people who who will go to work for years and feel these attacks, and then they'll disappear all of a sudden. I remember somebody was on my staff when I was a manager, and I'd been a manager at a couple of places, but there's one particular place. This person did not come back to work by fax. They sent in their resignation by fax. That's how that was. And then I saw her at a gas station sometime later that year, and he said, I just got tired of all the things. And all the things that she was counting, I had become completely oblivious to.
Right.
It wasn't the fact that even things that were even said, it was a lot of the things that were unsaid.
Yep.
It was the fact that they were doing, this department was getting these things, and I asked for it, and I was speaking German or some other language.
Right.
Or I was, these people were being treated in this way, and then when I asked about it, it was like nobody wanted to pay attention to me. So it's not the fact that all these things are something that are said, but there are a lot of things that are unsaid as well.
Sure. And, like you said, I think people sharing their experience. I mean, I can't do a workshop and it not be interactive, especially on this topic.
Right.
And that's part of why I've avoided doing it virtually, is because of that. But what people also have to realize, like let's say you're a business owner or an executive, well, how important is this to me? There's a book called The Cost of Bad Behavior, How Incivility is Affecting the Workplace. It's by Pearson and Porath. And they didn't use microaggression just from the standpoint of diversity, but just when we're incivil with each other, what happens?
Right.
And here's what they figured out. One incident, 48% of people will intentionally decrease their work effort. 47% of people will intentionally decrease their time at work. 38% of people will intentionally decrease their work quality. And then check this out. 80% of people will just lose time at work thinking about it. You got to go back and decompress what just happened. You're not working. You're thinking about what just happened.
Right.
But get this. Kind of along what you just said now, 66% of the people said their performance declined. 78% of people said their commitment to the organization declined. And we're not talking about intentionally now, but you're right. This starts to build up, and you're like, well, why would I want to go through this all the time? And eventually it happens. And the problem is many of the offenders don't realize they're offending.
Right.
And like you said earlier, they think they're giving a compliment.
Right.
Boy, you look really attractive today. That could be considered a compliment, but to some it's like, well, but
today.
Today, or is that really, why are you noticing that? Or, you see that on LinkedIn a lot where people are like, man, that's a really attractive photo. It's like, well, this is not the venue for that.
Right.
So they think they're giving a compliment, but it ends up being perceived in a different way because different intentions are being shown. So, that's the challenge. Oh, my. Is that how it looks on mine to you? Am I sideways? Do I have to change the camera?
Well, that's interesting because I would have thought
this is my first Facebook Live. So are we sideways? Do I have to turn the camera the other way, guys?
Yeah.
Tell me now.
Yeah, really.
If not, get used to seeing me
I
like
know.
that. Right?
And guys,
of course,
again,
we're an hour into it already. So.
Right. This is experimentation, and I guess we're learning the hard way.
Yeah. Well.
So.
No, I'm good. Mine's cool. Thanks, Nancy.
Well,
Nancy, I went to college with, by the way.
Oh, really?
So, yeah.
Hey, Nancy.
Thanks. And Rich, I went to college with too. And Rich and Nancy know each other and probably don't realize they're on Facebook together. So that's a whole other story.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
We're going pretty deep here. But no, this is good. This is excellent. And a shout out to Janine Truitt, one of my partners in crime.
Thanks, Jeff.
And it's great to see you guys. And again, we're taking questions. I'm just kind of to make sure that my personal page gets this too. I just realized that it's not on my personal page.
Oh, good point. Yeah, if you have any questions, we certainly want to answer them. We're not going to go too much longer.
Right.
I do think a couple of things we should consider, things that can help to counteract this. One of the things is, we talked about being aware of things, but exposing yourself to other people. There's actually a study done, probably pull it up in a second. There's a study done, they took a control group of college students, they gave them the implicit associations test, and they had one group take a general education class, but it was taught by a very attractive white woman. Mm-hmm. And after the end of the semester, they became actually more biased towards, more of a preference for people who are white. But then they had another group take a diversity class taught by a black male professor. And at the end of their semester, their associations became more neutral. And part of the conversation they had was how much they liked the professor. And so when they had a positive experience of being exposed to someone who was different, it actually changed their bias. Because a lot of people say, oh, you can't change a person's bias. Actually, you can change a person's bias.
Yeah.
Okay, so that type of exposure, so that's something we should all consider because we hear things all the time. And we have very limited experience with those people. And so if we don't go out and actually try to get experience with someone, for example, and we'll just, elephant in the room, this day and age, people who are Muslim, there's a lot of prejudice against Islam. But as you start to know more people and meet more people, you'll realize you're hearing a lot more propaganda than truth.
Right.
Okay? Or as a person said in one of my workshops a couple of weeks ago, it's amazing how your perspective of a person with disability changes the minute you have a disabled child. Now it's a totally different world, and your empathy changes, your viewpoint changes, and how you view everyone with a disability changes. So it's a big deal.
Yeah, that's one of the groups that there's is going to need to be dealt with in a slightly different way these days. Is people who are differently abled or disabled, ex-offenders.
Ex-offenders, huge.
As they begin to go back into the workforce.
Huge.
Women there's still this great big barrier that they're facing, and all the other things that are coming into play, like the pay gap is a big one, and we can probably go on and on. But I think, again, making the unconscious conscious, having to have that dialogue is a big part of moving forward. In your workplace or in your church or in your community.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, I'm looking at some of the questions that are being put out here, which are phenomenal. Sheila, actually, we both know, just talked about inclusion organizationally. One of the things, so it's funny, done these workshops recently, gone well. The only negative was they're not long enough, of course. But each location now has said, we're going to put together a diversity council, and we want to know how to do something about it. So I'm actually right now in the process of creating an entire change management program that will allow, that will work through this. One of the simple things that an organization can do is, especially if they have any type of mentoring program, is making sure there's diversity between the mentors and mentees so they get this different exposure and different perspective. Okay? So, for example, normally if I'm teaching a group of supervisors, I will tell them all, hey, you know what? You need to make sure you have at least 3 mentors, but they can't all look like you. That has to be the rule. At least one of them has to be of a different race or a different gender. You have to get a different perspective. And that's really, really, really a big deal. So that's a very simple thing that organizations can do. Or they could do it, they can very intentionally do it when they're putting together their temporary work groups, because everybody has to work in projects. You can make sure there's diversity within the projects. Or because I do a lot of work with federal organizations, they do what I'm going to use the phrase assignment. That's not the proper phrase anymore. I'm kind of spacing out. But I think I just froze for a second.
Yeah, I was bounced out. But go ahead.
I'm sorry. But so one of the things, though, that can be done is that organizations can make sure in their projects that they're doing it. Oh, it's temporary assignments. That's what it was. I'm sorry. So in the federal government, one of the ways they cross-train, they may give a person 3 or 4 or 6 month assignment on going to a different part of the organization, but to make sure that's being done in an inclusive way, and to make sure, number one, you have different demographics getting those opportunities, but that make sure that each department is getting multiple people of different demographics. It can't be just one, because they're going to experience solo status. So there are some very specific things we can start to do if we really want to have inclusion. I mean, training is good first because you have to have awareness. Okay?
Right.
But there also has to be a change management component of it, because we will naturally go back to the old way. Okay? So we've got to be able to create an infrastructure now to have true change, because the goal is not diversity. The goal is always inclusion. And until we create that environment, and until you create an environment where, let's say, we're working together and you have a microaggression against me, if there's no avenue for me to say it safely, then it's never going to happen. It's just like when companies have these anti-bullying policies, statistically, if you report bullying, you're more likely to get retaliation than results. So most people just don't report it. It's not worth it.
Yeah, I think people need to feel safe in having those discussions, and usually by the time that somebody brings it to another person, it's not the onesies that they're worried about, because it's likely that person has had a number of infractions faced against them anyway. So they've grown a very thick skin, and sometimes maybe even oblivious to it, but it can get to the point to where there's a pattern that's been established, and this person is bringing it to you because it's a pattern, not particularly that you said something wrong. It's not just the one thing that you said. There's a series of things that have occurred to the point to where, okay, we got to deal with this because I'm tired of getting beaten up every day.
Right. Well, and that's a great point, because the other thing we have to do, because we're all human, got to give each other grace. We're all going to slip up.
Right.
Okay? So is that one worth bringing up? Is that an infraction? Is that going to really turn my perspective of that person? But yeah, one of the things that's helped for me, so I'm thinking of an organization I'm working with right now, is when it starts from the top down, and the person at the top very humbly acknowledges their faults. So I have a client who is a direct report to a presidential appointee, right? And we want to put together this entire program. But he tells us that, look, I am a good-hearted, but I am a 50-something-year-old white male. I know I do things. I don't know what they are. But doing that, plays a big role, and it really does help.
Yeah.
Having that model, because then it becomes more acceptable.
Right.
To deal with it.
Yeah, I think for the most part that people are also willing. I think people are willing to forgive and forget, but they have to truly. Okay, maybe forget might be a little more difficult for some than others, but for the fact that they're willing to move on, there needs to be this dialogue that needs to be had if there's a pattern that goes on. And you know what happens in the office. It's just not the one person that they feel victimized. If there are other people that looks like them or they relate to, they're going to go talk to those people. So then it just doesn't become one person. It becomes several people having this issue possibly against this one person.
Yeah.
And but that's just a natural part of it, isn't it? I mean, don't you, when something happens to your house or to your car, you want to know, am I the only one who's going through this?
Right.
Why me? And then when you find that other people, you feel like there's some empowerment that goes on there, that now that perhaps by having this dialogue, we can move forward, even if we need to bring out the dirt.
Yeah. I think the majority of people want to have the dialogue.
Yeah. I think so too.
And even looking at my Facebook live feed, it's a very diverse group of people.
Yeah.
I think people want to have the dialogue, but they want to feel safe in doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they don't want to, because we all have faults, and I think we feel bad enough when we make the mistake.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but
Right.
then to be beat over the head with it afterwards makes it very difficult. And so when you can start off with the reality, hey, look, I don't expect any of us to be unbiased. But now I want to talk about how can we work together to deal with it.
Yeah.
It's a great opportunity.
Yeah. Again, it's that having that amicable, respectful conversation about it to where you feel safe whenever it happens, and that you leave that there's some respect that you've gotten out of it.
Sure.
After you've had it. But if you don't have those expectations out of it, if you're just looking to vent, then you just get instant gratification instead of
Right.
a long-term solution.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, and yeah, great point. And also, along with that, over time we do want to change the biases by giving these people exposures. And
Sure.
I think I look at who I am now. It's very different than who I was 15 years ago.
Right.
Because of my experiences.
Yeah.
And that allows us to do it.
Yeah, when I went to University of North Georgia, and one of the first things I said, I am a recovering chauvinist, because that's the way I was brought up. My
Be protected.
really? Yeah. I said I'm a recovering chauvinist. Yeah, I was once a chauvinist pig, but I was upgraded to just being a chauvinist. But I think all in all, but you think about it. Those of us who were born in the 60s and 70s, the things that were taught and the things that were caught, made victims out of women if you're a man.
Absolutely.
And so it takes years of orientation in that way, and it takes years of debriefing and depressing those parts of your speech and the way that you feel and your views. So you got to give people some room to deal with that. And some people, probably a whole lot fewer than some, will want to say, hey, can you help me with, if you hear something like that again, please let me know, because I see what it's done and what it does to you and what it's done to a lot of my coworkers, and I don't feel good about it.
Yeah.
And help that person move forward with it.
Yeah, Jeff Grossbeck, who I actually went to high school with, just said something similar. He says, you learn from your mistakes.
Yeah, yeah.
And the key is, to me, the key is...
Hopefully you learn from your
well,
mistakes.
that's the thing. Not everyone learns from their mistakes.
No.
Some people justify their mistakes.
No, because they look at their right to say it, or I hate being politically correct, and I just want to say what I want to say.
Right.
Well, yeah, everybody, if you're going to be abusive, you don't want somebody to stop you in the middle of it,
Right.
because you feel a certain way about it. But you have to understand, a lot of it is about the receiver. They're feeling attacked by your words, even as well-intentioned as it is.
Yep, and even Sheila just mentioned that when you shared and admitted that very bias you're talking about when you gave that presentation a few weeks ago, that was very disarming for people and it was very helpful.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's part of the key for all of us, because we are... we're idiots, okay, just by the way. Because we're not perfect, one of the things that has been helpful for me in a big way has been the more that I can model it and say, and that's why even when I give a presentation, it's far less for me about my negative experiences or my emotions. It's a lot about data, but I also I'm more likely to share what I've done wrong
Right.
than what I've experienced. Because
Yeah.
I think people need to feel, hey, you know what? You're just as human as I am. I'm just as human as you are. And if you're willing to make that admission, then I'm more likely to do it. And I think when we come off more attacking or militant or you've got to see my point, then what we do is we bring up people's defenses. So I applaud you for, approaching it from that perspective.
Yeah, and I think more people can do that more often if they're willing to. If you're looking to build a workplace that's an actual team, even on the fundamental level, that people will respond to you favorably and would have your back even in spite of your biases.
Yep.
I mean, it's really important that people feel like that they can talk about anything, which a lot of people do in the workplace anyway.
Yeah, right. They can talk about it.
I mean, people are pretty right, and you hear more than what you really want to hear. I mean, I don't know how many times I've said in my lifetime, really, that's too much information. I don't need to know, and I've even experienced where people, not just people will even talk about, I'm going to divorce my wife before they've actually talked to their wife about divorcing or talked to the husband about divorcing. I mean, it's really one of those things where we are capable of having this conversation and having, one that will, again, foster respect and something that's really safe for the workplace and really something safe for people that come into your workplace new, that they can feel a part of it a lot quicker than we're able because we've dealt with those underlying issues.
Yeah, I think personally, and for me, and I think for you as well, this can't be a moment. It's got to be a movement.
Oh, without doubt.
Because I think people look at our world and they think it just shouldn't be this way.
Mm-hmm.
And I know with people are like, is it worse than it was before? Well, it's not that it's worse than it was before. It's there's that song, Gil Scott-Heron, "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised."
Right. Mm-hmm.
Well, he didn't know there was going to be social media.
Yeah,
so
right.
The revolution is going to be televised now.
Right.
I think in my ignorance, I thought, because these are things I had experienced all my life, okay?
Sure.
I've been profiled by the police. I've been pulled over in Georgia and told my car was stolen and you're going to jail. All these things have happened. Mm-hmm. But I think there was an expectation that, well, when you guys actually see this, then you'll get it. And then people see it and they didn't get it.
Right.
And I think that was very disheartening for me. I lost a lot of faith in people. I'm like, you can see this person clearly being treated wrong, abused, shot unjustly, and still defend the situation. Mm-hmm. That hurt a lot. Okay.
Right.
But I think what happens is people are looking at our world and saying it shouldn't be this way. Okay?
Right.
They don't know what the solution is, but they don't want it to be this way. The danger is that often with our biases, because we want to be right, part of the way we justify it is we dehumanize other people.
Yeah.
So that when Stephanie says, if you feel justified in your action, you're less likely to change, it comes from our dehumanizing of each other. And the more we humanize each other again, the more we're able to deal with these biases. Because as much as I want to change the world, the truth is, for everybody who's watching here, you spend more of your waking hours at work than you do anywhere else.
Right.
So if you can change your workplace, you could have a great impact on the world. And if you could change your workplace, you'll probably change your own emotional state, your emotional health, and your stress level, because that's where you spend all your time.
Yeah.
So that's really important for us.
Yeah, and, as I think about it, as we've always had to deal with unconscious bias on different levels, and people have different stories, I think one of the things that still often happens that those who have power and have influence will make a safe haven to avoid those that dialogue.
Yep.
There's a college that I know of. Actually, there's a couple of colleges that I know of where, because they don't want to deal with people that don't look like with them, they have most of the campus is just them. Not going to say what ethnicity, you could probably guess which one. But the other two campuses are. But yet, when it came to publishing or promoting their particular college, they presented this poster, and you probably heard about it. This is a poster, and this was a couple of years ago, where there are 4 people in a race. Mm-hmm. And I found this on the internet. And, there were 2 white guys crossing the finish line. The third place was a Latina woman making it. And then the fourth guy is a black guy struggling to make it, about to fall down across the finish line. Now, this made national news. Mm-hmm. This poster and this image went viral. There were some things that were said by Bill Maher. There was a whole article written by New York Times. I mean, but what do you expect when you got 76% of the population on campus is one way, and then everybody else is kind of lagging behind? This is the image you got. You'll say, well, I'm not racist. Well, okay, but you produced this image,
right?
Which really, it speaks to the bias being unconscious, but your willingness to try to avoid the mistake, which you end up making the same mistake anyway.
Right. By the way, Sheila and James Parker are counting this as personal development training.
Oh, okay.
So we need to send them an invoice.
Oh, okay.
Just make sure.
Okay. Well, not a problem here.
Yeah. Okay. Just it ain't free. No,
not really.
No, we could talk about this forever, and I think we need to have further conversation.
Yes.
I want to make sure that we can talk about it in such a way that we're really talking about how we can get results. Because, it opens up a conversation. Mm-hmm. We barely even touch the iceberg on just the number of stats that are out there about how bias exists. Mm-hmm. But, one of the easiest things as an organization you can do, number one, look at the numbers. Mm-hmm. Look at your hiring numbers. Look at where they are, in the food chain, all of these things, because the numbers don't lie, and often we're not willing to look at the numbers.
Right.
Look at your complaint data, and then take that data and organize it by different demographics, whether it's gender, whether it's by race, whether anything that you're concerned about, mm-hmm. because you're going to find a lot of hidden gems in that area.
Right.
It's the willingness. Here's the thing: as much as we're trying to make this as comfortable as possible, it's an uncomfortable task to go on in an organization to turn it around, okay? But you've got to be willing to make that commitment and take on that fight. I mean, we can provide resources on how to go through the whole change management process, how to give the instruction, how to do it. And I think the vast majority of people are really good-hearted, okay? Mm-hmm. But I also think just because someone says they're not a racist doesn't mean they're not a racist.
Right.
It's like I had a conversation with someone who said, well, I can't be a racist because my girlfriend's black. I'm like, you know what? Slave owners used to sleep with black women. That means nothing to me. And it's, you don't want to hear that. But, if your actions are screaming one thing, your lack of self-awareness is not our objective.
We can go through the whole thing that because Barack Obama was elected, that the nation can't be racist anymore, or for the fact that there's one, that we have multicultural dating and marriage doesn't mean we don't have to go, or for the fact that white people can adopt black babies or black people can adopt white babies. We can do a lot of those things are peripheral compared to what the real problems are.
Right.
And those real problems don't exist in the most obvious things. They exist in very small pockets and in microcosms. If we can put a word to it, that would be it. So really, Tony, thanks a lot for joining us here. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the man, Tony Chatman. And, of course, how can people get a hold of you if they want to engage more of a conversation with you?
Sure. So, number one, you can go to my website, www.tonychatman.com. That's CHATMAN, TonyChatman.com. You can also find me on Facebook under Tony Chatman. There's an email, speaker@tonychatman.com. All of those things are easy ways to get a hold of me. We'll put a little link on the bottom of both of these live feeds.
Yes.
I do think we should look at, in the future, a follow-up to
Yeah,
this.
absolutely.
And maybe we'll find a location, see if we can get some of you guys to come out. I know there's sicknesses going around like crazy.
Yeah, the
but
timing was there.
I would love to have lots of interaction, lots of input, but also I want to say, okay, we're going to give you 5 steps. I'm going to give you 3 steps individually and 3 or 4 steps organizationally that you can do to combat bias.
Like a town hall.
Like a town hall.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's some very well-researched bias disruptors that are out there.
Mm-hmm.
And they're simple. They're actually incredibly simple to do.
Mm-hmm.
They're low risk, but bless you. But what's amazing is a little bit of bias goes a long way in an organization. And we could show a chart on that on another time as well.
Sure.
And thus a little bit of fix goes a long way. A lot of times we think we have to have this mountain-moving fix to change things. And these little things, they actually really go through the whole way.
Yeah.
So, if you get a hold of me, get a hold of Mark. We're really doing a lot of work. I'm hoping to have a book on bias coming out soon. I know we're both going to be writing a lot of articles, doing a lot of training. I'm all over the country right now, but certainly if you'd like for your organization to hire me to bring me in, hit me up on Facebook, look at my website. You can easily contact me. Trust me, I will make you look like a superstar for choosing me. Okay? Just letting you know.
Without a doubt. And we've been planning this, by the way, for almost 2 years now.
I think it has been. It's hilarious.
Yep, we try to say, well, what subject we're going, and then with all the discussions we've had over Facebook and over time, this came up. Then he started to speak on it. Then I start to speak on it. Start to write on it. And thus we have this, we're saying things that really a lot of people are not willing to talk about.
Yeah.
I know a lot of my colleagues are not willing to have this discussion because, they're not at that point yet.
Right.
But overall, I think that if you really want to have some more dialogue with this, meaningful dialogue, come hit us up. We're going to do something together. Maybe we can do it maybe late summer or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
And do a town hall and actually be a lot more intentional about it. But this was a great experiment. I think it was a successful one. In the meantime, anything you need to add? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, one thing. I have a Facebook fan page. It's Tony Chatman, The Blueprint, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Shoot questions there. I want to be very engaged with you on it. Or find me on Twitter on Tony Chatman. I'm at Tony Chatman. But part of what I want to be able to do is answer your questions. The whole goal of this is to work together on this. And even though I think I have a very well-rounded perspective, I also know I'm biased.
Yeah.
Right? So I need your help and your perspective. And the whole goal of this is, let's have something that we can all invest ourselves in to really make a change. Because, I think far less about how this looks for me and far more about how this is going to look for my kids and my grandkids down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tony, so much. Thanks
This
for
is a great guy. Make sure you're checking out his podcast all of the time. Make sure you're talking about, because you're on my Facebook Live. Tell them about your podcast.
Yep. Well, my podcast, Voice of Job Seekers, and you can find it at voiceofjobseekers.com. We are just talking about a variety of career conversations and career subjects to help you job search, to help you interview better, to help you write better resumes, to help you find a better opportunity. And also in my talks about unconscious bias, I probably complement Tony's a little bit more as far as the job search and hiring and plus more.
Right.
So really, we may even meet in the middle at some point.
We may meet in the middle, absolutely. All right, great.
So that'll be it for now. I'm going to sign off. Thank you very much. Peace in the Valley of
Thanks,
Love.
guys, for
Thank
joining
you very
us.
much. Thank you
Had a
guys
lot
for
of
coming
fun.
here. And this experiment was a success. Thank you very much for joining
Thanks,
us.
guys, for being on Facebook. We're going to do some more like this, okay?
Right on. And as far as the podcast audience, thank you guys. Join me next week for more. And this is a long one, but feel free to download and share whenever you get a chance. Thanks.
Yeah.
See you next week.
See you guys.